Welcome to the Indigenous Navigator Survey module on human rights and environmental due diligence and Indigenous peoples' rights. In this video, we give you an introduction to the reason why this module was developed, the purpose of this module, what it covers, and offer some examples of how the data you generate can be used. Why this module on human rights and environmental due diligence and Indigenous peoples? Indigenous peoples continue to face serious human rights abuses caused by business activities on their communities, lands, and territories. These harms are not limited to one sector. While the energy and mining industries are often involved, many other sectors also contribute to these abuses. A key reason these abuses persist is the lack of effective laws, procedures, and enforcement mechanisms to ensure that businesses respect both human rights and the environment. As a result, Indigenous peoples' rights are frequently violated, notably their cultural rights, their rights to land, territories, and resources, and their right to free, prior, and informed consent, also known as FPIC. The Indigenous Navigator has long provided a way to track how well states are implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP, and related binding treaties. Indigenous communities have also used it to collect data on and analyze how their rights are being realized in practice. However, the current Indigenous Navigator surveys and data does not systematically capture how governments are living up to their obligations to protect Indigenous peoples from business-related abuse or harm, or the extent to which business activities are linked to the human rights abuses and harms Indigenous peoples face. To address this gap, the Indigenous Navigator Initiative has developed a new module on human rights and environmental due diligence. The new module has two main purposes. First, it helps monitor how well policies, laws, and plans are being adopted and implemented to ensure that businesses respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. Secondly, it supports Indigenous communities in documenting their own experiences, especially those involving negative human rights and environmental impacts caused by business activities and operations. How is the module structured? The module has two surveys. Both surveys focus on business activities that have taken place within the last 5 years. The National Survey. This survey assesses gaps in laws, policies, plans, and implementation frameworks. It looks at how well business activities are regulated and whether requirements for human rights and environmental due diligence are in place from an Indigenous peoples and human rights perspective. It also collects data at national level on the extent of abuses and harms on Indigenous peoples and their lands, territories, and resources. The Community Survey. The Community Survey helps document the lived experiences of Indigenous peoples in terms of the abuses and harms caused by business activities on and around their lands, territories, and resources. It also assesses the implementation of any existing laws, policies, plans, and implementation frameworks seen from the perspective of their community. Both surveys are organized into 9 thematic domains. These domains follow the structure of the UNDRIP as defined by Indigenous peoples through consultations during the development of the main surveys. However, this module includes only those domains where business impacts are known to be significant: self-determination, cultural integrity, lands, territories, and resources, fundamental rights and freedoms, participation in public life, legal protection, access to justice and remedy, general economic and social development, health, and employment and occupation. How was the module developed? The surveys have been developed in close cooperation with Indigenous peoples organizations and follow the methodology which has been used for the primary Indigenous Navigator surveys. They are therefore built on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or OHCHR, methodology for human rights indicators and for the purpose of the Indigenous Navigator, anchored in UNDRIP. The methodology calls for the development of 3 categories of indicators: structural, process, and outcome indicators. Structural indicators measure states' commitments in the form of legal, institutional, and policy frameworks that support the realization of rights, such as laws recognizing indigenous lands and territories. Process indicators track state efforts and actions to implement these commitments and rights, such as procedures for the identification, demarcation, mapping and registration of indigenous peoples' lands and territories. Outcome indicators assess the actual enjoyment of rights, such as percentage of indigenous communities with secure land tenure. This structured approach enables indigenous peoples to systematically monitor how their rights are being respected, protected, and fulfilled. The human rights and environmental due diligence surveys are directly linked to key international standards. These standards can be grouped as follows. Instruments focused on business impacts. These include the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, also known as the UNGPs, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises on Responsible Business Conduct, and the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct. Human rights and environmental instruments. The following list of instruments is relevant here. United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. ILO Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention number 169. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. Convention on the Rights of the Child. American Convention on Human Rights. American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. African Charter on Human and Peoples' Rights. Convention on Biological Diversity. Regional Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation and Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean, also known as the Escazú Agreement. UNECE Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision-Making and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters, also known as the Aarhus Convention, and the Paris Agreement. How can the data collected from these assessments be used? Here are some examples of how the data can be used. The data can be used for the following: to create greater awareness within indigenous communities of their rights and human rights and environmental impacts of business activities. For example, when implementing the module in a community, the leading organization could consider conducting capacity-building workshops for members of the community on their rights in relation to business activities. To inform and strengthen indigenous people's own development projects and programs. Understanding how business activities affect indigenous livelihoods helps communities pinpoint the most urgent issues. This allows them to prioritize projects that address those specific challenges, like environmental restoration, cultural preservation, or health services. To support indigenous people's advocacy related to human rights and environmental due diligence policies, plans, measures, laws, and implementation frameworks at national levels. Having solid data gives indigenous communities a stronger voice when engaging with governments, companies, or international bodies. It helps back up claims and demands with evidence to help push for policy changes, and to feed into context analysis, program developments, and risk assessments related to business activities, human rights, and environmental due diligence in indigenous peoples. For example, business actors trying to identify and assess human rights risks as part of practicing human rights due diligence could draw on the data recorded under the new module for human rights impact assessments. Thank you for joining this video. Please explore the other video tutorials and materials on this page, should you need further guidance in using the surveys and planning capacity building workshops.